again, thank you, Paul, for all that great information. Assurance to our attendees, we will distribute all the information that Paul provided to you via email after this conference. And now we're going to move along. Our next speaker with the topic of ensuring safety with employee rights in mind is Todd, and I really should have checked with you on how to pronounce your last name before we got started. But I'm going to give it a shot. Photopulos.
That's really, really close. It's Photopulos. Everyone just calls me Photo. It's a lot easier, or people can just call me Todd. So I answer to just about anything, to be honest. But I appreciate it, Andre. And I appreciate the mayor's office and the chamber for including us today. Paul, I have to say it was really good to hear a reformed or recovering lawyer's perspective as a business owner and operator on how this is going. This is, I think, probably the most interesting time that I've had practicing law. I've been in the private practice of law now for 23 years, which is hard for me to really believe. And in our practice, I'm at the Butler Snow law firm and in the labor and employment group there, and we dedicate our time to advising employers like yourselves on navigating these issues. And this is a really interesting intersection between the law and science and policy. So everything is emerging in a rapid succession. I mean, the law by its very nature is a extremely conservative institution and doesn't change rapidly, is not really amenable by design to rapid change. And that has certainly been an interesting situation to watch in the current situation, because in my lifetime as a lawyer, I have never seen a proliferation of law like I have right now, and I probably never will. The amount of the volume of information that's coming from the government, from the federal government, from the state government, from the local governments, is simply just amazing, at times overwhelming. We spend a remarkable amount of time studying and trying to keep up with latest developments in the law and trying to bring that to you guys. So I've only got about 10 or so minutes to go through some of the health and safety issues. And Andre, if you don't mind hitting the next slide for me. And so I'm gonna do that as quickly as I can, with the caveat that while there has been a proliferation of law regarding leave issues like the Families First Act that Paul mentioned, the CARES Act that created some of these loan opportunities and so forth, and also the unemployment insurance issues. On the safety side, the science is developing so quickly, and the understanding of the science is developing so quickly that the law has not had a chance to catch up. But it is really interesting to watch the government, both from the state level and then on the local level, respond to all of this, recognizing obviously the differences in different areas and the clustering effect that this pandemic can certainly have, and giving localities like Shelby County the opportunity to develop, in conjunction with our health personnel, a local response. And I'm really pleased to see that being a coordinated response among the mayor of the city of Memphis and Mayor Harris, and then of course also the other 6 mayors of the local municipalities. So I do think that it is creating an environment where it's a smart, reasoned, and flexible approach, and that does make things challenging for an employer. Certainly, I think that the government is looking to the science to decide what the next step is going to be in terms of safety, in terms of reintroducing the economy and workers into that economy. And then at the same time, the government is looking to you guys, the business owners, on how to most effectively implement this. And there is going to be a significant balance between all 3 of these groups, all 3 of these interests: the science, the policy, and employment, and in the law. And so that's going to be interesting to watch. But employers and how well we all implement this, it's going to be a real litmus test for moving on to phases 1, 2, and 3, and hopefully beyond in the short term. So I think that we all certainly have a part in addressing these issues. I was really pleased to hear Paul's discussion about the steps that Jack Morris has taken in terms of developing a plan and then marketing and promoting that plan and implementing that plan at the workplace, and also as they are getting out to the public. I think that's going to be really, really important. And so I'm going to go into a whole lot of detail as quickly as I can on the law, but I think that what Paul mentioned is probably the most important takeaway for all the small businesses out there, and that's to really be intentional about developing a plan internally and externally, and then marketing that plan, knowing that the general public is going to judge your performance on implementing that plan and the safety measures you've taken. Your workers are going to judge that performance, and the government is going to judge that performance ultimately in a collective manner by looking at the overall numbers and determining whether or not it's safe for us to move into the next phase and open up the economy even more. Next slide, please, Andre. Okay, so interestingly enough, there is really no specific standard that's been set by the federal government in terms of a law on how to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. I think most people are familiar with OSHA as the relevant governing agency that monitors workplace safety. And so absent a law, we always look to the general duty clause, and that's for an employer to provide a safe place of employment free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. Of course, in this current environment, free from recognized hazards with an invisible enemy challenging us all, it can become very, very difficult. A practical consideration for an employer is whether or not there is a recordable injury under OSHA for OSHA Form 300. And the general basis for that would be whether or not an employee has an actual diagnosis of COVID-19 and whether the infection occurred at the workplace. I think as a practical matter, the takeaway there is it's going to be really hard for an employer to be required to meet both of those standards. First, getting an actual diagnosis of COVID-19 is a challenge. It's not just a suspected infection that would trigger the reporting obligation or recording obligation. And then the second part, the infection occurred at the workplace. I think that's a real challenge as well, because it's really hard to determine, obviously, where that infection took place. Was it at home? Was it at the grocery store? Or was it from a coworker at the workplace? But the most important, I think, element for employers to keep in mind on this particular slide is the retaliation prohibition. I do anticipate that once this all starts to resolve, that you're going to see a proliferation of retaliation claims by employees or former employees against employers. And the general theory there would be that an employee cannot be retaliated against for raising a safety concern, a legitimate safety concern to the employer. So make sure you're aware of that. Make sure your frontline management is aware of that as well. Next slide, please. So OSHA categorizes employers and their employee complement in terms of levels of risk. Most of our employment group is going to fall within the lower level of risk, and there's a baseline listing of suggested precautions for those employers to take with regard to that employee complement. And incidentally, while OSHA has not actually come up with a regulation addressing COVID-19, there is a fairly helpful guidance that's on point that's been published by OSHA, and it's about a 33-page or so document that's pretty straightforward. I'd recommend you familiarize yourself with it. a lot of this information comes straight from that. And that can be found most quickly by just Googling OSHA COVID-19, and it should be the very first document that you find. After my presentation, I'll hop on the chat feature on this Zoom conference, Andre, and find the link to that and include that for the group. But looking at this pyramid here, you can see that most of the employees from OSHA standpoint are going to be in the lower risk category, and they're going to be general principles that they apply for safety in the workplace. Moving up the chain to the medium risk, that's going to be most commonly thought of as your Walmart employee, your grocery store employee, those employees who have a high degree of contact with the public or work in locations that have a high density of employees where social distancing may be difficult, and so forth. When you move up the pyramid into the high and the very high category, then you start to move into the healthcare worker and mortuary workers, people working in labs, and that sort of thing. So they're going to be higher standards expected for those types of employees with regard to personal protective equipment and so forth. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a good general slide, and Andre, I'm hoping that these slides may be available to the group publicly after he's nodding his head, so I'm pleased to hear that. So you might be able to take these away with you. These are a lot of what your grandmother taught you, to be quite honest. And while it does seem like a lot of just general common sense that OSHA and other groups are promoting, I do think it is really, really important to be thinking about these issues intentionally and not taking them for granted. And then I do think that it's really, really important to be meeting with your employees as you're bringing them back on, both your management level employees and your frontline workers, to make sure that they are understanding their personal requirements and also understanding what steps that our employers are taking to make sure that as best we can, in light of current science, we are meeting the needs of creating a safe and productive workplace for them. So frequently washing your hands with soap and water is obviously important. Encouraging respiratory etiquette, coughing into your sleeve, into your elbow, and that sort of thing. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, mouth with unwashed hands. I have to admit that being on this Zoom conference and other Zoom conferences like this, I get disappointed in myself as I notice myself on video itching my face constantly, so try to avoid that. Avoiding close contact with people who are sick, exploring whether flexible work schedules and work hours might make sense. Looking at more untraditional work situations where you are staggering shifts to try and decrease the number of employees. Looking at what employees are really essential to be there, what employees could effectively work from home, and also maintaining and making sure that we're maintaining regular workplace cleaning opportunities to disinfect, particularly those high usage areas, and so forth. Like Paul mentioned for his business, who's developed a policy on these types of issues, I'd make sure that you are looking at what your policies are in terms of how do you identify a potentially infected individual, how employers should inform and encourage self-monitoring. So you want to make sure that employees understand that if they have a concern about their own health, that they recognize what the signs are for COVID-19, the potential signs that the CDC has routinely been publishing and updating, and make sure that they know who within the organization to report that to, so that appropriate steps can be taken to try and remove those employees from others and so forth. When you move up the chain for medium risk employees, then you want to make sure that you're thinking about physical barriers and so forth. We've all been to grocery stores or other locations and are starting to notice the plexiglass, and that's okay, Andre, you can go on to the next slide, that's just fine. We're starting to notice the plexiglass up, the face masks on employees. I think this does a couple of things. I think it makes your employees obviously less susceptible if they have high contact with the general public from getting infected. I think it also gives a degree of certainty and comfort to your employees or your customers that are coming in, and also it's going to help encourage the government who's responsible for the overall policy to make sure that we are in a safe environment. Andre, I hope I'm doing okay on time, and I apologize. I know I'm putting a lot of material out there. All right, I got the good thumbs up. You know, I would be looking at, and this slide that Andre has up is just a real basic slide on how to disinfect. That this was actually sent to us by Dr. Buddy Creech, who's an infectious disease epidemiologist at Vanderbilt University. We've been consulting a lot with Dr. Creech on workplace safety issues from a science standpoint, and incorporating that into our advice to clients. One thing, let me mention real quick, Andre, if you don't mind, and I'll put this in the chat as well, but we do, our firm, if you Google Butler Snow and Coronavirus Hub, you'll be taken to our page that is a repository of updated information like this type of presentation, other current periodicals that we're preparing and advising clients on. So there is a pretty strong and robust and constantly updated amount of information that's on that site on a variety of different levels, from employment issues also to the issues that Paul was addressing in terms of the PPP loans and other things like that. So, you know, when we're talking about exposure and recommended engineering controls, such as putting up plexiglass and so forth, don't forget to be thinking about, in terms of your operations and policies, making sure you're looking at your air handling systems, your ventilation, if, you know, the way that you can increase ventilation, natural airflow is one of the things that Dr. Creech has really stressed to us. Implementing exposure prevention procedures for your employees, making sure that employees who are in high-risk workplaces are given the protective equipment that they need, either on a voluntary nature or mandatory nature, depending on the nature of the workforce. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the outset, this is one of these times in our lives where law and policy and science all intersect. So I've been talking a little bit about the law, which unfortunately is really at this point just a set of guidelines that OSHA has set forth and not regulatory requirements. I'd like to move now into the CDC's guidance that for employers and how to respond. So this is the science, and I think this is really, really important, that even though we don't have hard and fast regulations necessarily in place for a lot of this, that employers are being mindful of current guidance that's being updated daily, so that we can all respond. As I mentioned, this, you guys are going to be, you're on the front lines on the reintroduction of the economy, and you're going to be judged by it, unfortunately, and that judgment can come in the form of retaliatory discharge and retaliation, other retaliation claims in the future. And a lot of that is going to be judged based on how well you did in terms of looking at current guidance at the time, recognizing that it's evolving and not necessarily perfect, and what you did to respond to that and to try and create as safe an environment as possible. Generally speaking, the CDC thinks about a plan for employers to focus on reducing transmission among employees first and foremost, maintaining healthy business operations, and maintaining a healthy work environment. So those three buckets. Looking at the reduced transmission employees, that would be actively encouraging sick employees to stay home, identifying where and how workers might have been exposed to COVID-19 at work, or whether they were exposed elsewhere and brought it to work. Obviously separating sick employees from the other employees, removing them, isolating them, and providing telework opportunities. where possible. And of course, educating management and employees about how they can reduce the spread of COVID-19. I would just make sure that you are both in terms of your written communications online, your written communications at the work site, and your in-person meetings. Make sure that you are constantly updating and training your workforce so that if in the event there is one day a retaliation claim or this becomes an issue for you, you can safely look back and say, these are the steps we took, and this is how we sought to try and make sure everyone was safe, in lines with current guidance from CDC and other organizations. In terms of maintaining a healthy business operation, I'd really recommend identifying an individual or group of individuals to be a workplace coordinator responsible for handling COVID-19 issues and their impact at the work site. So make sure there's one or a couple of people that are responsible at your place of business for keeping track and keeping updated on the CDC's latest guidance and being the go-to contact for employees who have a concern, so that they know where to go and meet with someone about their personal issues or about issues they're seeing at work and their concerns. Implementing flexible sick leave and supportive policies and practices is another way that the CDC is recommending that businesses help maintain a healthy business operation and assess your essential functions and the reliance that others in the community have on your services and products, so you can determine who needs to really be at work, who needs to be in contact with the public, and who can be working from home, and so forth. So, and obviously considering your policies and practices for social distancing. We've all been to the grocery stores and seen the tape lines on the floor to remind us all to keep 6 feet away from each other and that sort of thing. So think about that in your own workplace. In terms of maintaining a healthy work environment, look at your engineering controls that you've got for your business. I mentioned this earlier, increasing your ventilation rates, the amount of outdoor air that circulates. Make sure that you're supporting respiratory etiquette and hand hygiene for employees, customers, and worksite visitors. If you have the ability to install some of those foam or other sanitary dispensing pieces of equipment at doors and bathrooms and that sort of thing, make sure that's done. Make sure your bathrooms are clean that are being used for public consumption, with the ability for people to grab paper towels, open up handles, and so forth. Have your employees wear masks where appropriate. I know some of the latest guidance from the county and the city and the municipalities are going to, as we move into these 3 phases, are going to require those certainly for certain employers. So be thinking about that. And then if we're, next slide, Andre, the final thing I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is if you do have employers in critical infrastructure, with critical infrastructure workers, that you're really mindful about how you return employees once they have become asymptomatic and no longer showing symptoms, and make sure that you're doing that appropriately. The CDC really broadly defines who is a critical infrastructure worker. Some of the obvious people would be law enforcement, 911 call center employees, and so forth. But then you can also think about janitorial staff and custodial staff and workers in food and agricultural enterprises, and IT workers are even included. So there are a lot of workers that are included in that category that the CDC is advocating. Andre, that's all I had. I know I was throwing a lot out, everyone. I appreciate everyone's time and attention.
All right, thank you very much, Todd. And we're going to open it up now for questions. If you'd like to ask a question of the speaker, go ahead and click to raise your hand. Our first question is going to come from Kara.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you, yeah.
I have a service business. We are a safe and lock company, so I've got technicians that go out to customers to help secure them for the end of the day and everything like that. we've got practices in place where we take their temperatures every day. They wear masks, gloves, and they clean everything once they are finished doing their work. However, they're out and about touching handles and things of that nature and having exposure to this COVID-19 on a daily basis. If they should contract the COVID-19, I foresee them relating it to a business, doing part of their business. Do we just file a workers' comp claim at that point, or how do we go about that?
That's a great question, Karen. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, it's really hard to tease out when an infection actually occurred. So, you'd want to go ahead and ask all the relevant questions, in terms of where they've been, in terms of other interactions they've had, any illnesses at the household that you need to be aware of, and when did the symptoms first develop, and so forth. But I would go ahead and begin the workers' comp process and try and get it funneled that way, if at all possible, because under the law, there's the concept of exclusive remedy, under workers' comp for workplace injuries, and it would be nice to go ahead and have that covered there if you can.
All right, a couple more quick questions before we move on. Let's see. This is Dottie.
Thank you. Hey, Todd.
Hey, Dottie, how are you?
I'm fine. Karen just said that she's taking her employees' temperature, but what are the other things that we should be doing when we get to a back to work situation? Questions we can ask, questions we shouldn't ask, besides taking temperature of our.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dottie, and Dottie and I go way back, so I appreciate you being on the call and asking the question. So I think that certainly the EEOC has issued some guidance, and this opens up probably a topic for another day that may warrant a completely independent presentation. So Andre, if there's ever any desire to do that, just note that we'd be happy to do that, because there's a lot of emerging guidance that's coming out of the EEOC, in particular with regard to how to handle this. And I'm going to make a note to put onto the chat feature the guidance that the EEOC has published, because it's actually pretty helpful in terms of what you can and can't do. But the EEOC has affirmatively said that you can ask employees to have their temperature taken. You can ask certain questions about where employees have been, and so forth. One of the issues, Dottie, that we're seeing that's related to this is how do employers respond when an employee may not have followed appropriate safety measures and so forth. And we had a client in particular who had an employee that left to go to a funeral, and with the understanding that it would be and this is earlier on in the process in March, and the employee promised that they would be exercising social distancing and so forth, and then promptly posted on Facebook, the types of pictures that you would expect at a large family gathering like that. And unfortunately, it created an environment where it just wasn't safe to let that employee come back to work. So the EEOC's guidance, I think, is really helpful, walking through those types of scenarios and addressing how to handle complex, fact-specific issues like that. So I do think you're smart to be thinking about it, and I would commend everyone to look at the EEOC's guidance. I think that our firm also has a link on our Corona Hub that I'll include that discusses some of that as well.